Well, that's
I need,
straight Photoshop there. So
yeah, I need to do it. Take all the gray hair out, put like a red. I'll be back in just 2 seconds.
sure. All right. So it doesn't look like our
He's gonna go
speaker.
about 10 minutes. I just talked to him this morning. He'll be in about 5 minutes, I guess, maybe even less. He making the host, whatever, making the co-host. That's fine. He didn't care.
Hmm.
I think Trevor Bird is on here too, man, one of my star students. He's faded out on me already, you know. But Joe, Zoom's working for everyone. I get a lot of good.
Well, good. Yeah, it seems to be like we made the correct call on which platform to
Yeah.
go with.
Oh yeah, man. What would have been the other options? What were the other possibilities? Is there a
Well, we
Google
have,
product?
yeah. I mean, more so for people that already had like the Google Suite kind of incorporated into their
Yeah.
infrastructure, But
Yeah.
we have Teams, obviously, and that's
Yeah.
still available. But the majority of instructors had already were already using Zoom in some capacity for their classes. So that was the word we got was, hey, can we
Yeah.
go with Zoom? So we gave it a shot, and we liked it internally here in the department.
It's
So
working.
yeah, it
Now,
is easy. It is easy to use.
now,
Of all the ones I've used in the past, it's the easiest of all.
now, do students have a Zoom account as well? Is that their student login?
Yeah, they get provisioned a basic account, not a
Yeah. How does
licensed
that work?
account when they log in. We've got it. We've got it tied to our D2L account.
Here's our
So
speaker.
when they log in via D2L, it automatically creates them a guest account or a basic account, I should say.
Okay, so they just use their student login.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Here's our speakers here. Hey, Bruce. I think Bruce is here. He's logging in.
Yeah. He's still muted. There he is.
Hey, Ren.
How
Hey,
are you?
Bruce. Hey,
Hey,
Bruce.
how are you?
Hey, Ren. Hey,
Hi.
Ren.
Let me get the camera off my off my books and papers there in the background.
You have to get. Yeah, that's one of the problems. There's a guy on Twitter. I forget his name. He evaluates the background that people use,
Yeah.
and it's some of these Washington insider types that's lived in DC 50 years have these fancy houses that they bought with nice bookcases, and he gives them a high rating. I think he would give me a really bad rating, but
Well, look at my background. You can see Faulkner behind me.
yeah,
I'm
There you
very
go.
proud.
you
You're
got
all set.
Faulkner.
At least I kept my dogs outside. That was my
Yeah.
big promotion for the look of the place. No Newfoundlands slobbering all over everything.
So, Bruce, this is Dr. Denton,
Hi.
English professor, and you'll see Dean Cunha, my fellow
Morning.
political scientist, and my successor as dean. I don't know if he can hear us yet. Don't hold that against him. He didn't create any of the problems I did. And Joe, the guy with the glamour shot, that's Joe. He's our main IT guys. He's
I've taken it down, so you probably can't see it.
no, it's a good picture, Joe. I just wish I
Yeah.
had one. It's what Nietzsche called resentment. I wish I had one. Professor Whitaker, English as well, logging on.
Hi.
I've already warned Bruce that Carlos is a political scientist, so he's skeptical already. Of course, Bruce is as well.
I'm skeptical of everything. It's my job.
Yeah.
I'm not skeptical of the title, though. The title sounds good.
Well, there you go.
So I talked to Bruce earlier. I was telling him I was on a panel at the digital virtual American Political Science Association meeting last weekend, and there was a guy on the panel that I realized was younger than our daughter. He's at the University of Chicago, and not a tenure track. He's at the University of Chicago. And also, he looked younger than my grandson, so he scared the living tar out of me. And he was so smart, and I was like, man, why did I waste all those years playing football and whatever else I was doing? So, of course, the guy, you know, I mean, who knows what? It's his first year teaching. His very first class was coming up this week. So I was praying for him and also hoping that he was going to survive, because he'd been in England. I was telling Bruce he'd been in England for 4 years, writing a dissertation. He had a tweed jacket and a you know, one of those little funny things they put inside the shirt. I was like, man, that would never make it in South Georgia.
He was wearing an ascot.
He was wearing an ascot. Thank you. Klaus Frohnen.
You save those for the yacht, you know?
No, yeah, I'm just a poor hillbilly. I don't have a yacht. I have a John boat, but it didn't even work too well. Randy Carter, our former colleague, Randy Carter's political scientist, is supposed to fix it for me, but he never fixed it. So I don't have any seats. I have to stand up in the boat, you know. But he never fixed it, so I was out of luck. I'm still out of luck.
Aren't we all? Well, this should be fun. What's the format going to be?
Well, I'm going to introduce the event and introduce the political science folks, and then turn it over to fellow political scientist Tom Chiazzo, who's our political science functions as essentially our political science chair. He's going to introduce you. We'll turn things over to you, and we'll just proceed. And then Bruce wants a lot of time for questions and discussions, which I think will be good. And he knows who Trump's Supreme Court pick is going to be, so he's going to share that with us as well.
It's 50-50, Lee. Nobody's sure between the two, I don't think.
I wouldn't put Bruce or myself, and we're not in this camp, but Bruce and I know a lot of political scientists, legal professor types who are sort of, and Bruce, I don't want to mischaracterize these people, but extreme natural law folks, and they're really pushing Barrett. I think, yeah, they're really pushing her. So
yeah, but I think Legayo is a safer bet.
Strong, safer bet.
Yeah, just Cuban vote. Florida's important, but I don't know how it'll turn out. Could be either one of the two. If we're just handicapping here.
My wife thinks that it should be Barrett because she has 7 children, and that's the most amazing thing that can be humanly accomplished. I don't know if that's not a basis for Supreme. Ren, I know, is several children, so she deserves consideration as well, because it's
certainly a sign of fortitude, if nothing else.
Yeah, it is. I have 1. That's all we can handle. So, I didn't do very well at that. I mean, I'm pretty much punted. So, as we say in football. So we'll start in about 8 minutes or so. Tom Chiazzo is connecting.
There's a YouTube link. I think probably a lot of our students will probably be watching from there. I sent my class over and told them to write up a summary for a little bit of credit. So there may not be a lot of people here, but they may be on YouTube. Is somebody manning YouTube for questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Does that mean we get monetized? Do I get a cut of this?
Yeah, you do. You get all the money we make, which is going to be a big pile of money, Bruce. So get prepared. Sort of like an old guy I used to be at Lee University when I taught there, and I think I had published 2 books, and he spread a word on campus that Lee Cheek was a millionaire, and he had published these 2 books, and he was really rich. And like word got to me, I walked over to see him. He's a biologist, nice guy, named Robert West. He's just still wonderful. I said, listen, Bob, you need to know that everything I've ever published in my life is a net loss. I'm even poorer and more outcast than I was before. So don't worry about it.
What I love are getting those, and I get them from 3 publishers now. Every year I get notices that tell me basically how much I still owe them.
Right.
Because
sure,
they're not going to send anything until I get over the advance and sell a certain number of copies. So they say, well, you earned $45 today. So it means you really only owe us $1,500 still.
Yeah, right. Well, and Bruce, this is our fellow political science colleague, our chair, Tom Chiazzo.
Hi, Tom.
Morning. Hey, Bruce. Morning.
Good to see you.
Tom has been at East Georgia longer than any of us. I believe this. He is our most senior political scientist in terms of tenure at the institution. Carlos and I are more aged than Professor Chiazzo. That doesn't mean we're wiser necessarily. It just means that we're had more years around.
Now, what's the town that East Georgia's in?
We're in
Excuse
three
my
towns. The historic campus is in Swainsboro, which is sort of equidistant between Macon and Savannah. And
Sure.
we have a campus in Statesboro where Ren teaches, and a campus in Augusta, embedded on the Augusta University campus.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
Yes.
See, I've been to all these places around it back when I lived in Atlanta. And, you know, we used to have conferences, Liberty Funds in Savannah all the time.
Right. And
So
that's
I've
really
been all around the area, but I haven't actually been, I don't think I've even driven through where your actual campus is.
And Bruce was our guest speaker several years, 2 years ago at the Georgia Political Science meeting, and the conference's guest speaker, and Tom and was on a panel with us, and Daniel, who'll be chiming in a moment. I think Larson was here as well then on the panel as well. But Larson just couldn't take us anymore. He had to move west. He felt the urge so many Americans feel to go west, but he didn't go far enough. He only went as far as Oklahoma. I told him he should go to Alaska if he wanted to go west, go California, Hawaii. I mean, you can really go west, I guess. But so we miss him, but he left us at the end of last semester. We're actually here most of the summer, I think.
You got tired of seeing trees?
Yes, I think his wife's from Seattle, want to move more in that direction. I said, wait, you still got quite a drive from Oklahoma.
Georgia's more like Seattle than Oklahoma is. At least you've got trees and mountains.
Trees, and they're green. And we have Professor Joyner, who is our department chair, is here. Very nice, good friend.
Good morning.
Good morning, Courtney. We have Tony DiLorenzo. He's in Chicago. He ought to be really happy given how well the Cubs are doing. He should just be having fun, not worry about anything else in the world. Hey, Anthony, glad to have you with us, my friend. We have Kat Moore. She actually runs East Georgia. She's in charge of the whole campus, more or less. She can't hear me yet, so I can say things like that. I'm not sure what is, but that's the great thing about Zoom. You can be in the middle of a lecture and a cat jumps up on the screen. That's what's happening. And that's been very exciting. In fact, I had 3 cats in one class. I said, wait a minute, we need to just turn the class over to them because, this is very much like American politics. Getting these 3 cats to calm down.
Only if you start trying to herd them.
Yes, that's true. That's true. We have Dr. Vess with us. Good to see Dr. Vess. I'm going to start in just a few minutes.
Is Dr. Cunha going to wear his patriotic hat today?
Which patriotic hat?
Don't you have one?
Um,
There you go. Come on.
How about the Mario Brothers?
There you go. See, I'm changing hats now. I'm changing hats. It is Constitution Day.
Nobody told me I was here for a party.
It's Constitution Day. Every day's a party with the Constitution. Come on, Dr. Frohnen.
If I had known hats were required, I would have gotten in on that.
See?
See, I have no hair. That's the problem. Very little hair. I don't have a glamour shot like Joe, so I'm at a disadvantage. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll go ahead and get started. And first of all, it's just wonderful to see everyone here and be part of this conversation. And welcome to the 2020 Constitution Day for East Georgia State College, an event sponsored by the college, the Political Science Program, and the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And we have a lot of decorative hats and decorative personalities gathered here. Our guest speaker is Dr. Bruce Frohnen, who will be introduced by Dr. Chiazzo in just a few moments. I'll just mention that Dr. Frohnen and I go back to 1988 when we were on a panel together at the Southern Political Science Association. And I said, this is really a smart guy and a brilliant paper. And Bruce and I were both finishing our graduate work. Bruce was finishing at Cornell University, and he went on and earned a law degree. And he's a political scientist, and he's a lawyer and a law professor. So he's a very dangerous fellow, and he's going to be our speaker today. Bruce is going to speak about 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and then turn it over to us. So we have a dialogue with him, and we will adjourn at 12. So I'm going to turn things over to my esteemed colleague, Tom, man, myth, legend, Chiazzo, who will introduce Dr. Frohnen and turn things over to him.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Cheek. And Dr. Frohnen, it's again a pleasure to hear from you today. And on behalf of everyone listening, I hope everyone is safe and healthy. And Dr. Frohnen holds the Ella and Ernest Fisher Chair. Okay. You hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Frohnen holds the Ella and Ernest Fisher Chair at Ohio Northern University School of Law. He has served as a legislative aide for a United States Senator, as a visiting scholar at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and held visiting posts at Charles Evans Hughes Professor of Jurisprudence at Colgate University, and as Thomas Basin and Ann Bassett Stanley Professor of Ethics and Integrity at Virginia Military Institute. We look forward to hearing from you, sir, and I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Tom. Appreciate that. And good to see all of you, especially my good friend Lee, who obviously doesn't remember our time as well as he thinks if he thought that I gave a good talk. Although it was always good to hear Lee engaging with the other members of his own panel and telling them what's what. So it's great to be with you. It's an important day, I think, to talk about the Constitution. But I want to take a slightly different approach to it. The title has to do with the new imperial presidency, but I want to talk less about any particular person than about the institution. I know that in particular these days, there's a lot of focus on the personality, really, of Donald Trump. Our current president has been in the news pretty much since he started running for president. And there are a lot of people quite concerned with the forms of action that he's taken, and especially with his rhetoric. But to my mind, in dealing with the imperial presidency, which I think is a real concern to any constitutionalist, it's important to understand the background, where we are, but also how we got here. Because I think the problems go much deeper than the personality of any particular inhabitant of the Oval Office, regardless of what one thinks of him. And actually, I think it's quite helpful to look at one of the more recent events. There was a Supreme Court case on it that people were quite concerned about, intimating that Trump was acting outside the law as an imperial president. And that had to do with the so-called Dreamers legislation and the DACA, which was deferred enforcement and deportation of persons here without documentation, potentially illegally. And there was again, it was an important Supreme Court case decided quite recently in which President Trump's attempt to unravel is the phrase that was shown a lot, this deferred enforcement mechanism was struck down by the Supreme Court for not following the particular provisions of the Administrative Procedure Act. Now, this all sounds very eye-glazingly boring, I know, and frankly, a lot of it is. But there's a lot of important rights that are concerned here. And to me, the most important thing about this is what the context is within which this argument is going on. The Supreme Court said basically that Trump couldn't do away with this deferred enforcement the way that he tried to, which is he didn't make the right arguments for it. But that if he were to reformulate his arguments, he might be able to undo it. Here's the thing. What he was trying to undo was not, in fact, a law. He was trying to undo a memo. Under the Obama administration, the decision was made that in enforcing the so-called Dreamers Act, this had to do, again, with those who were in the country illegally, especially children who were brought here early in their lives and have been living here the whole time. The argument was that it was unfair to deport them. And beyond this, there came about this idea that enforcement of deportations should be prioritized. All right, and this, it makes sense in a lot of ways. The argument that the Obama administration put forward was, look, we have only so many resources. We can't simply round up anyone who's not here perfectly legally and throw them out. So what we need to do is decide on priorities. Now, this is something that executives do all the time. It's called prosecutorial discretion. Not everybody who breaks a law is immediately prosecuted. Some laws are more important than others. We only have so many police. We only have so many prosecutors. So there's a thing called prosecutorial discretion. The unusual thing about this memo was that it gave us a three-tiered classification of people who would be deported and people who would not. And those who fit into this one category here, who were not considered risks, would not, in fact, have actions taken against them. Instead, they'd register, they'd ask for a deferral, and they would be given the right to work and access to various government benefits. Whatever you think of the underlying policy, that's not my point at all. My point is simply that this is an executive order. This is not a law. So we're fighting over whether one president can undo the non-law decisions of a former president. And this is pretty odd, frankly, in terms of the Constitution, because Congress hadn't spoken to these issues. Whether you think Trump should or should not have undone this, whether you think Obama should or should not have done this, the point is none of this is in the realm of law. And that when I talk about the imperial presidency, what I'm talking about is this ability of presidents increasingly over the last several decades to act outside the law. And this is clearly in opposition to the original understanding of what a president is in the American context, which is that unlike what you had with the British king, the British monarch had a thing called the prerogative power. They had, from time immemorial, been able to act outside the law for the public good. This was a prerogative. It was outside the law. But in the American context, because we were afraid of the overreaching of monarchs and other people who might oppress us, the understanding had always been that presidents are bound by law, and especially by the law of the Constitution, just like everybody else. So a president can, in fact, be sued just like anybody else. There's no immunity, as there is in many other countries. There was a case in Italy just a few years ago where you had the premier who was charged with having sex with underage prostitutes. The response was, you can't prosecute me. I'm currently serving in the government. And that flew. Immunity, government immunity. Historically, we haven't had those kinds of rules in the United States. Okay? What we've had has been the rule specifically of law. And law was defined in very formalistic terms. A law, anything affecting the rights and duties of American citizens, has to go through a very specific process. Congress has to argue over it. Congress has to pass it in both houses in the same exact form, present it to the president for potential veto. If it's vetoed, then they have to override it with a vote of 2/3, and that makes it a law. Anything less than that cannot rule on its own authority. That's what the rule of law means within the American Constitution. But over time, we've seen a huge delegation of lawmaking power to the executive branch. Now, much of this took place in the early part of the 20th century with the building of what usually goes by the term the administrative state, or the fourth branch of government, right? There was, in response to various troubles, various problems, interstate commerce, impure foods and drugs, there was established specific agencies that were intended to oversee and create regulations to help govern particular areas of the economy and the government itself. Now, at the beginning, these were simply vehicles for carrying out legislation. But over time, an increasing amount of discretion was handed over as well. In particular, in the time during which the New Deal came about as a response to the Great Depression, you had swaths of power being handed over to agencies with very little in the way of congressional guidelines, let alone specific law. There was a very famous case, Schechter Poultry, in which the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. You must have actual rules that determine what the agency is to do. The purpose of the statute has to be laid out, what it is that we're aiming at, what the goals are, and how they're to be achieved. That administrative agencies are supposed to administer, not make law. But this became a dead letter very quickly. And what you had instead was the development of administrative state with oversight from Congress. Okay? Over the length of several decades, what you had was the development of a different form of lawmaking that I would argue is not in keeping with the Constitution and has allowed for the development of very much an imperial presidency that doesn't in fact rule by law. Now, this is not to say that it's necessary if you're going to have an administrative state, if you're going to have occupational safety and health administration, if you're going to have an environmental protection agency, if the government is going to take responsibility for clean food, healthy workplaces, a clean environment, you can't have law, all right? Our Constitution doesn't dictate that there can be no regulations in these areas. We can have arguments about how far it can go given the lengths of enumerated powers and given the nature of federalism. My point is different. It has to do with the form. And it would be entirely possible, Philip Hamburger has written a book that goes to this somewhat as well. It would be entirely possible to have an administrative state that abides by our constitutional requirements and thereby also affords people who are regulated their proper legal protections. Because one of the many problems with our administrative state is that most of the time, people aren't charged by a real court. They're charged by an administrative court, and they don't have the rights that you and I take for granted. But in any event, the point is, Congress could have approached the problems of regulation by expanding the role of its committees. It could have taken into its committee on commerce the right to, the duty, to regulate trucking companies, for example, and kept within its own committees and their staff the ability to write the specific regulations, okay? The argument against this is that we need experts, and experts have to be non-political. Whether there's any truth to that or not, what the Constitution allows for is a committee staff that would write these regulations, and the members of Congress would then have to adopt them. They'd have to put their own signature on them saying, we, the members of this committee, believe that these are the right regulations to have, okay, what the trucking schedules can be. And then each House of Congress votes on it, the president signs or vetoes, and so on. This has not been the way it's happened from the beginning, though. Instead, the decision has been made that Congress will simply say, as it almost exactly said, there shall be safety and health in the workplace. sets up the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and leaves it on its own. What's the difference between these, you may ask? The difference is responsibility. Okay, the reason why our Constitution says these things should go through committees, both houses, bicameralism and presentment, is so that we know who's responsible for them. That is the lawmakers. In a very important book called Congress, Keystone of the Washington Establishment, published several decades ago, Morris Fiorina pointed out why this didn't happen. This didn't happen precisely because there's too much responsibility associated with it. As a practical matter, all the buildings that anyone who visits Washington, D.C. will see, all the government offices, there's no reason those should be filled with executive branch bureaucrats instead of legislative branch regulators who then report to the committees. Okay, handing over just the responsibility to prosecute violations to a beefed up Justice Department. But that would mean that members of Congress would have to take responsibility for the actions of these agencies. That would mean that members of Congress would get voted out of office far more often. Members of Congress are reelected almost habitually. What Fiorina argues, I think quite persuasively, is that members of Congress made a conscious decision that rather than doing all this work and taking all this responsibility for burdening people, it's much easier to pass broad swaths of legislation that say, you handle it, executive branch, let there be clean air, and then conduct oversight. It's a very nice gig. And when I was working for the Senate, I can tell you it's a very nice gig, because what you do is you take credit for the good stuff, and then you also take credit for helping your constituents. Most of what most members of Congress and senators do is actually called constituency services. They help people get their Social Security check. They help people get the EPA off their back by making phone calls, by sending angry letters. And you get to be a star in an oversight hearing, yelling at that bureaucrat for not doing their job. So what you have instead is a lack of responsibility, a great deal of publicity, and a guarantee of reelection. The problem with this, of course, is that it's not law. It hands over to people who aren't elected the right to make what are, in effect, laws, that is, that affect people's conduct, that affect their rights and duties, that can end up putting them, in fact, in some instances in jail, and can certainly close their businesses, without there being an appropriate responsibility. Instead, what we have under the Administrative Procedure Act is a right to have a comment period where groups, usually groups involved in the area, industry groups, occasionally lobbying groups, public interest groups, who then comment on the regulations, and we sort of bargain it out what we're going to end up with. Okay? What that ends up with, again, is not law-like. What it lacks is predictability. It's not announced to people. And it's led to a general dismissal of the formalities of constitutionalism that are necessary to give regular people notice of the rules that they're going to have to live by. Now, this is expanded in a number of ways that are more directly imperial, if you like. Okay? This delegation of power has certainly set up this fourth branch of government. But the next question is, well, how does that affect the president? Because presidents themselves often argue, oh, I can't control the bureaucracy, right? One hears a great deal these days about the deep state, conspiracy theories about the deep state. If you've seen any administrative agency, that's all that can meaningfully be called the deep state. That is, these are administrators who don't have to stand for election. It needn't be seen in some conspiratorial sense. These are simply unelected experts who serve under the civil service instead of being part of a spoils system. The problem with that, though, is presidents get frustrated at their inability to make their own policies matter. So what do they do then? They attempt to rule by decree. Again, I talked about the Obama administration's DACA decision, which went against the law, trying to order what the administrators in ICE, DHS, these various agencies, how they would conduct themselves. But it goes far beyond that. when Bush II, the second Bush administration, tried to put forward the No Child Left Behind legislation, they had to enact vast waivers for schools. This was all kinds of detailed regulations about what student would be taught what and what outcomes would have to come through it. Well, nobody fit the standards. So they had to grant broad waivers saying, okay, we know you didn't meet the standards, the law doesn't really work, but we don't want to take back the law. Instead, we'll say, we'll work with you. We'll make a deal between you and the agencies, Department of Education. We'll work it out over time. And this is a pattern. This is the way things are done. Legislation is passed, which is unrealistic, because again, Congress is used to just saying, let there be good things. And then you have to have executive action that acts as if it's legislation, but is really just sort of a matter of bargaining. The same thing happened under Obamacare with the Obama administration, vast waivers to try to get the fast food companies on board. And it goes far beyond that. You also have executive orders, which are essentially decrees from the president that can affect everything from clean water policy to a number of other activities, civil rights actions, but again, don't have the stamp of actual law. They're supposed to be merely a matter of internal housekeeping. But over time, they've more and more come to affect the day-to-day lives of normal American people. And really the reductio ad absurdum of all this, the signing statement. This is merely a statement that is put forward by a president on signing a piece of legislation. It's going into law. It's gone through the process now, and now it's law. Historically, they've just been a matter of thanking people. This is great. We hope this helps. Over time, beginning in the Reagan administration, accelerating in Clinton, reaching a breakneck speed in the second Bush administration, presidents started using these signing statements to make policy. One of the most infamous examples of this was with a law that John McCain authored. There was a provision that said the executive branch couldn't be engaged in enhanced interrogation techniques, right? It was called the torture memo, right? To which Bush II said in his signing statement, I'm signing this whole legislation because we need the money, but I think that this provision would trench upon my executive powers. So I'm going to interpret it as I think appropriate. And the way he thought appropriate was to ignore it. And you can point to dozens of these kinds of signing statements that have effectively changed the law. The same day, at the very time that a president is signing something into law, he's saying, I'm not going to enforce parts of this because I don't like them. A real problem in terms of the actual rule of law. And we actually have parts of our governmental structure. Bill Clinton signed put into existence the National Safety Office, Nuclear Safety Office, actual agencies that are begun with signing statements. Okay. Now, my point on this, in general, is that again simply that this isn't law. Whatever you think of the policies underlying it, we've gotten so sloppy in our understanding of what it means to issue an order, a rule that people have a moral obligation to follow, that it seemed we're reaching the point where we can say we're no longer ruled by law. We're ruled by quasi-law. We don't know what agency is going to present the rule, whether it's Congress, any number of executive agencies, the president himself, could be the courts. We don't know where a rule that could end up putting us in jail or putting us out of business, we don't know where it's going to come from. We don't know what the form's going to be, because oftentimes these are working out a bargain that's not taking place at the formal level. And we don't know what the rule is. So when I talk about an imperial presidency, what I'm really concerned with is that in the name of doing good, because most of the policies that are put forward here are aimed at doing good for the public, but we become so impatient with the idea of following rules. We become so concerned just with function. We want efficiency in putting our will into action that we've lost sight of the fact that a constitution is supposed to see to it that power is exercised in only certain ways by the right people in the right way, so that we'll know where the rule is coming from. We know what's required of us so that we can, in fact, be a free self-governing people. Because you can't be a free self-governing people if you don't know the rules that you're supposed to follow. So the Constitution, to my mind, provides the solution for all this, which is to say, you need to go back to the formal requirements, not of absolutely everything everywhere in specific terms, because it's a pretty broad set of rules. Congress has to consider it, Congress has to pass it, the president has to have a chance to veto and an override. It's not that hard. All it requires is that we insist that we'll only follow actual laws, and Congress sit up and take responsibility for its own actions. And that way the president, while no longer treated as having imperial power, will in fact have the capacity to do his real job, which is to see that the laws are faithfully executed. To see that they're faithfully executed, you have to know what they are and where they come from. That, to me, is the essence of constitutional government. And I'll stop there and take any questions or arguments.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Frohnen, and we'll give you an East Georgia digital response. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll turn open the floor for any questions or comments or insights that our academic community would like to offer.
Don't all speak at once.
I'll ask you a question just to get things started. I'm still trying to recover from Dr. Chiazzo's headgear, but that's enough to brighten up any situation. It seems to me there's a problem with an additional problem, and this may not be addition to anything that you said, but this quasi-law is ultimately undemocratic. It can't, it's not, there's no popular support. There's no consent, to use Lockean terms, really ultimately for it, or no revision of consent over time. But Congress likes that. The court likes that to some degree. It takes burden off the court. It seems to be there's a failure to assume one's democratic responsibilities. I'll give you a case study from ancient history. When I was a youngster, I worked in the House of Representatives, as you know, Bruce, and I worked for a member of Congress from Western North Carolina, where the great Smoky Mountain, Blue Ridge Parkway, all that area is there. Well, some bureaucrat in the Department of Interior decided they could buy 50 acres from a fellow and extend the park. Really nothing, very small and microscopic advancement compared to what was already there. But my member of Congress could go back and he could say, well, you know, I forced the Department of Interior to buy that extra land and we got a bigger parkway now. Not that he had any idea, God bless him, what was the consequences of that might be in terms of, and he never thought of the idea that Congress should play some role in making that decision or supervising that property. So I think what you're alluding to happens all the time. And is it persistently undermining American democracy or Republican rule?
Well, I think you're right, Lee, but here's the issue with that, though, because this can be sold as democratic in a very real sense, even though it undermines actual democratic accountability, which is, you know, most members of Congress sell themselves these days as glorified ombudsmen, right? An ombudsman is somebody who whose job it is to take complaints from citizens and try to work out their problems with government agencies. And this is clearly what somewhere between half and 2/3 of what happens in any congressional or even Senate office is. Again, it's trying to get that check from Social Security or trying to help, especially a powerful donor who's having a problem with, say, the EPA. So this is sold as answering to the people. But notice it's answering to the people in a patron-client relationship. That's not that one is the servant of the people in doing one's job of making law. It's doing favors. The problem with it is it really lends itself to corruption. And one of the things about your story, I mean, I'm not sure what exactly happened with the personalities involved, but that can easily be a matter of corruption. If that's a big donor who sold those 50 acres, and if those 50 acres sold for a lot of money, that would be pretty typical. If you understand, I mean, there's a lot of, did I hear someone? There's a lot of potential for corruption that's involved in this process.
That's an excellent point, and thank you very much, Dr. Frohnen. The floor is open for questions. I think Carlos and I, and maybe Tom, can unmute people, I believe, at this point. So if you have a question, please, we're honored to unmute you and hear your insight. Tomas.
Yes, Dr. Frohnen, Richard Neustadt's a hero of mine because he talks about the ability for presidents to have the ability to persuade and get their points across by using that power of persuasion. What is your evaluation of the current president and his ability to persuade? Do you think Richard Neustadt would say he's doing a good job pertaining to the executive branch getting what it wants and maybe influencing cabinet members to get what they want? Or do you think he's not doing such a good job?
Right. I think you've got a particular problem with this president because he is attempting to unravel much of the current makeup of that state. And here's the thing, you know, in a civil service environment, right, where it's extremely difficult to fire someone. I remember when I worked at the Justice Department, there was one person working there whose bosses had wanted to fire her for about 1.5 years. They ended up tasking one of the interns working there with basically shadowing her to try to find out everything that she did and create a dossier. It ended up being a folder that was about 2 inches thick. And then by the time they were ready to move, there was a change in administrations and it all went away. They couldn't fire the person. What that goes to, I think, Tom, is your point that persuasion is absolutely essential in this element. But the problem is many of the things that Donald Trump has stood for go to the heart of the way that administrators see their job. That is to say, you can persuade someone to change their trajectory by 5–10%. But are you going to get them to do an about face? And when it comes to policies such as in regard to Jerusalem, when you're getting to policies in regard to immigration, where you want fundamental change, I don't think that persuasion is going to do the job. You're in a different paradigm from what Neustadt was operating with it. And it is by nature, I think, far more conflictual. And that's, I think, what people fail to understand when they see Trump yelling a lot, saying these things, that he's trying something very different. His art of the deal is not necessarily a win-win situation. He's arguing with people who he wants to accept that they're going to lose significantly. And I'm not sure in that paradigm, if that's what we're dealing with, that persuasion is in fact an available tool. Kind of a new territory.
So on a follow-up, do you think he is doing a good job persuading?
I don't think he can persuade.
Well, what about outside of the continental United States? What about, like, for example, just the agreement that was made, the international agreement with, internationally, do you think he's persuading effectively there? Maybe because those outsiders aren't familiar too much what he's doing here.
Carlos may want to weigh in here, but
especially Portugal, the nation of Portugal. You never know.
Well, here's the thing about that, though. I mean, one of the things that I think people miss is that Donald Trump's mode of rhetoric is not all that unusual in an international sphere. If one reads the statements that come from, whether it's Iran, Pakistan, or a variety of other governments, outside the Anglosphere in continental Europe, the form of language that one hears from Donald Trump is not terribly unusual, especially if you're dealing with an adversary. So when you combine that with the fact that these Middle East negotiations have just been historic, it's clear that where there is a possible win-win, he's been actually quite effective. Again, whatever one thinks of the underlying policy, if you were merely talking about effectiveness, I don't see how that can be denied as effective, okay, in terms of what's happened between Israel and other countries in the Middle East. Again, that's not to say that one might not have a real problem with the policies underlying it, but he's gotten significant results. But again, I think it's different at the domestic level because there's not the same basis for saying that we can have a win-win outcome.
Mike Luzzi here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Fantastic. Sorry about the video. My camera's not working. Question I had was, given that we've gone down this path and people have gotten complacent about it, what is it going to take to break the cycle? Is it going to be something in the form of a judicial challenge, or does Congress have to be awakened in some way?
I'm sorry to say, I think what it's going to take is a pretty fundamental breakdown, which I think we're headed for. I know nobody talks about the national debt anymore, but we're in a position where, with everything that's gone on in response to COVID, there's a real significant possibility that the government is not going to be able to pay its bills fairly soon. And when that happens, when you have an enforced need to shrink what the government attempts to do, you're working again, and you're in a new problem situation where, because the problems are so dire, people are going to have to rethink this. Because one of the things that will be necessary, certainly in the short term, is a devolving of more power back to states and localities, because the federal government simply won't be able to pay the bills. So I think we're at a point, we're at such a crisis point right now, between political legitimacy, this election itself being so called into question, with the ability to pay bills, that I can't specifically predict what's going to happen next, but I do believe, frankly, that the lawlessness of so much of the administrative state, which has developed over several decades, has created a crisis of legitimacy and effectiveness. That being the case, it won't take much to tip us over into a place where Congress and the president have to rethink how it is that we're approaching this. Now, it could take a very different form from what I'm talking about here. There could, in fact, be a splitting up of the country itself. It would not shock me, given the way that this election looks to be shaping up, if there were, in fact, a questioning of the union itself. So this could come about in any number of ways, but what I will say is the system is reaching a denouement. It's not working, even though most of us out here think it's sort of working because we're still getting our checks. The economy is sort of working. The federal government still seems to be able to do things. We're reaching a point very soon where that's not going to any longer be the case.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Mike is a former Navy officer, so you got to watch out for him.
It's worse than that, Lee. I'm a former Navy nuke. Come on,
That's
be
what
serious.
I wasn't going to let that out, Mike, but thank you nevertheless, my friend. Bruce, what I'm being told is our live stream questions are coming slower than they should be coming. So I think we might have a student question from live stream in a minute, but just to kind of fill in, my wife and I have been reading Bob Woodward's Rage, book Rage. I'm sort of addicted to Woodward. It's kind of a, maybe it's I got a psychological.
Are you seeing someone about this?
Yeah, I am. And it's interesting that speaking of quasi law, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. He portrays the sort of three of the key people who Trump initially attempts to cajole into being part of the administration. He goes to Mattis. And Mattis is very reluctant, although he's an old soldier. He feels like he should be. Although he tells Trump said, "Oh, you're Mad Dog." He said, "No, that's not my name." So even Mattis doesn't want to acknowledge that. He then goes to Tillerson, and Tillerson does not want to do the job, but his wife says, you really should do that. He is like, he can't be managed. How do you manage the affairs of state, even though he's a person who's been in majority of countries in the world? Then he goes to Dan Coats, evangelical, former senator, former ambassador, and Coats really feels like, the director of national intelligence. No one can manage that in the post 9/11 state, and so it's interesting in the sense that they all sort of acknowledge the role of quasi-law and a bureaucracy. We're all kind of scared of the prospect. It always raises the question: can the federal government be managed in a traditional way anymore?
No. But I'd add to that, though. I don't think the federal government has been managed in a traditional fashion for some time. What you've had instead is we have had grow up a new ethic, a new constitutional morality, right? To use a phrase from our old friend George Carey, which is institutional in its character. One of the reasons so many people have completely flipped out under the Trump presidency is they see him as a savage. And this goes for a number of people that I used to work with in the Justice Department and other folks as well. They just see him as an existential threat to calm, ordered, expert administration. That is to the administrative state's very reason for being. It calls into question the whole progressive project, which is that the government is here to manage things for us. You, the people, will make grand statements of policy and choosing between two parties on a regular basis. They will give you a program of action. You will vote on that program of action. Then it will be handed over to the experts to put into reality according to a set of preset best practices. Now, in point of fact, those best practices have changed radically over the decades. But here, the thing is that regardless of the idea of office, that each elected officer has a responsibility to that office, what you have instead is the notion that the offices that matter are administrative, and they're about keeping the ship running quietly on an even keel. So that change itself is highly dangerous and to be avoided. What's curious about this is that the previous president, who ran on a platform of fundamental transformation, that we were at that time a colonial power that needed to have its power taken away, and we needed to institute programs to bring fundamental fairness to all aspects of life. This was not considered a danger, this formal transformation, this fundamental transformation. And the reason is quite simple. The same people would be used in the same way to carry out an extension of policies that already existed. Now, the fact that those policies, the Civil Rights Act's policies against discrimination, for example, the fact that those policies were going to be expanded in ways that the original drafters of that legislation hadn't intended, that didn't matter, because you're still talking about the same methodology. The same people would decide, well, what do current circumstances and our current policy goals dictate in terms of how we interpret this law? And how can we make that happen through government offices that are aimed at efficiently carrying these policies into action? See, that's the irony of the whole thing, is that Trump's policies are in fact more in keeping with those older readings. But because his methods go against the idea of an expert civil service that's to be given control over administration, which includes most policy choices, this is an existential threat to democratic governments. It's ironic. That's all I can say. It's highly ironic.
Thank you, sir. Floor is open for questions.
I don't know if I stunned you or put you to sleep, but okay.
No, there is a somewhat less than serious question that has been sent to us asking you, as a professor, as most of us are, and you do not have to answer this, but Mad Dog Mattis, General Mattis, at some point said that PowerPoint makes us dumb. And seeing what your view of that is as a longtime professor. And also, Matt is coming from a institution that makes tremendous use of PowerPoint as well, the U.S. military. So one of his more famous quotes, I'm sure he had to use as Secretary of Defense. Other questions? Bruce, feel free to answer that. You don't have to.
No, I'll go ahead and answer that actually, because one of my good friends in Washington was, he became Director of Naval Intelligence. And when he was working for the then Director of Naval Intelligence, he once told me, he came, we were supposed to have dinner and he was an hour late, and he said, the color of the central point was wrong in the PowerPoint. The color had to be different. He said 40 minutes getting the color just right, according to what the then Director of National Intelligence wanted. So let's just say I think it could be taken a bit too far, concerned with details on these things. But that said, I think I'm the only one on my faculty who doesn't make great use of PowerPoints.
Dr. Chiazzo.
Yeah, Bruce, I got another question, and maybe I'll twist it a little bit to get some more engagement on the other side of the coin. So on this past September 17th during class, I always, and every Constitution Day that I can remember, I try to always incorporate Charlie Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution, where, of course, he focuses on the economic views of why the Constitution was written in the first place. And really, we shouldn't be surprised today that the system is the way it is, because it has been created by people with wealth back in the day, and it continues to be driven by people with wealth. Look at all the senators, how much they make, our own Congressman Rick Allen, all the way up to the president. And maybe we as a pluralistic society see things not going that well. Maybe, 230 years later, it's exactly the way it was when it started, because things are going very, very well for a small group of people in this country. How can you effectively tell people that American government is for the average person when definitely it isn't at all that way? How would you teach that in a classroom without using your energy and enthusiasm, and try to be honest with them? Because the reality is that America's government is nothing at the federal level except for the rich people. How would you address that?
I guess what I'd say is, when government goes beyond its proper job, which is to keep the peace, including among primary fundamental groups, it's going to favor somebody. And who's it going to favor? People with political access. That's the way politics are. The difference between a free country and a country that isn't free is that in a free country, the people who get rich do so through their own efforts. In a non-free country where the government controls these things, the path to riches is through political power. And you'd have a hard time finding a regime on the face of the earth where that wasn't the case. Government is always a danger to normal people. The question is, how can we keep it doing its basic jobs while not helping out the wrong people? One of the things I always find interesting is people talk about, Amazon. You people who are supposedly against government, why are you suddenly talking about picking on Amazon? Well, a lot of people have a problem with Amazon, not because Jeff Bezos is successful, but because Jeff Bezos became successful on the backs of those who had to pay taxes that he didn't have to pay for a couple of decades. Most massive semi-monopolies are the product of governmental interference. The tax breaks that Amazon piled up during its first couple of decades of existence made possible its dominance in the market now. The same can be said of the railroads back in the 19th century, most of which began with state grants of vast sums of money during the post-Civil War era. robber barons tend to be stealing from the public purse before they steal from anything else. So while I do agree that it seems like the federal government is not helping most of the rest of us, I don't look for it to help. I just would like if it would hurt a little bit less. And I think that requires that this set of agencies run by bureaucrats be brought back under control to serve the law instead of the interests of the agencies that they're, the industries that they're regulating. It's not easy. There's no clear answer because politics is messy, but politics is also power. And the only way to address it is to lessen the power.
Thank you. Mhm.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open for questions. Professor Mansell, I think, may have just left temporarily, but he told me he was going to tell me who Trump was going to appoint to the court before he left, but he just left without telling me. So Bruce, it's up to you to tell us that, and tell us also, if you would, what do you think of the idea that's being kicked around that, we've have two famous court packing plans in the life of the Republic, the Lincolnian plan and then the FDR plan. There's within the last few days, since Friday, since Justice Ginsburg passed away, there's this idea has been floated again. How would that work, and would it work? So I'm asking your pick and what you think.
Well, on the first question, I think it's going to be one of two Catholic women, either Amy Coney Barrett or Julia Lugano. I think it's more likely to be a Cuban American with Florida connections than it's going to be a Notre Dame professor. But either way, it's going to be a Catholic female. And I think it's going to be tough to stop this from happening, because after what happened with the Kavanaugh hearings, all of the problems in terms of evidence or non-evidence being brought up at the end, I think the Republicans have decided they really have no option but to go. I think one of the problems with floating these ideas that everything is on the table is that it really says to Republicans that no matter what they do, everything's going to be on the table should they lose the Senate. As to the court packing idea, I think it depends on how the election comes out. If the Democrats were to take both the presidency and Senate, I think anything could happen, including an expansion of the Supreme Court by at least 2 seats. And it's, remember, that's not a constitutional provision. The Constitution doesn't say you'll have 9. We've had fewer. It's grown over the years in any event. So it could change. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment. So if you were to have all 3, Senate, House, and President in Democratic hands at the end of this, I think it's entirely possible that you will have an expanded Supreme Court, however much, probably 2, because that seems to be a fairly easy number to talk about. And you can still have, in theory, 1 panel. The problem is at a certain point, a lot of countries have Supreme Courts with more members than we've got, but usually they sit in 2 separate benches because it just doesn't work to have that many people up there making arguments. It just becomes a kind of voting body like a legislature. But it would not surprise me at all if that were to happen. Now, would that happen if the Democrats took the Senate but not the presidency? I don't think there's any chance. So I think it just completely depends upon what happens at the polls.
On the other side of that, Bruce, do you see any resignations forthcoming or in the future? Anybody leaving the court? How about Breyer or Thomas, our local?
I think in both cases you'll probably have to pry their cold dead hands off the keyboard, off the gavel. Thomas, because he was in. I met him a few times, and it was just clear. I'm no buddy or anything like that. But I met him a few times, and it was just visceral. His anger at what had been done to him at those hearings, and his determination to be there as long as he could to do what he saw as right. The other side, in terms of Breyer, I think that I think it's important to know that you know, Breyer is a very smart guy, but he also really enjoys the job. And the thing about bringing a Supreme Court justice is it's a pretty nice gig. All the hard work is done by these really smart clerks who just got out of Harvard, and it seems to always be Harvard. But in any event, they just got out of law school. They're more than happy to work 60 hours a week doing all your grunt work for you. It's a great gig. I remember seeing an interview with Thurgood Marshall, who was not a young man at this point, who was occasionally made fun of because he left early. He didn't leave nearly as early as William O. Douglas did. But in any event, there was talk about this. It was an interview, and then one of the interviewers, what he said first was he needed to get home to watch the People's Court. Then the interviewer said to him, and he said it with a smile, this was a guy who was not worried at all. And he read part of his opinion to him, and he said, "Oh, did I write that? Wow, pretty good, not bad." And my point is not to pick on Thurgood Marshall. It's to say, this is a nice gig. When you get older, you just don't work as much. So I don't think, you know, a lot of people were upset, liberals, that Ruth Bader Ginsburg didn't retire. But I think she seriously thought, you know, I can keep going on this maybe forever, because the hours are what you decide to make them.
Excellent point, Bruce. And we have a question from Professor Joyner, and we're almost out of time, so this will probably be our last question, but let me convey her question, if I might. Do you see anyone serving in political office today who will follow the Constitution without manipulation for their own political gain?
Can you read that to me again?
Yes, sir. Do you see anyone serving in political office today who will follow the Constitution without manipulation for their own political gain?
I hate to sound like such a cynic, so let me try not to sound totally like a cynic and say, I'm not sure we any longer understand how to uphold the Constitution without approaching it for our own political gain. And I guess the best spin I can put on this is, I'll go back to the old idea of constitutional morality. If checks and balances are going to work, you have to be willing to defend your position, defend your institution, right? Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. That means, I think, that the framers of the Constitution understood that people were going to read that document in a way that served them. Right? Congress is the most important. No, the president is the most important. And one of the things actually that's gotten us into such a difficult situation in terms of our legitimacy is that members of Congress no longer identify their political advantage with the political advantage of Congress. Because if they identified more fully with their own institution, what really matters is Congress makes the laws and that has to be respected. I wish they had more of an identification of their interest on that. And if they fought more for that, they said, I want to be an important senator in an important institution. That kind of reading of the document, which would still be partial, right, would actually serve the rule of law and constitutional government. So, you know, I agree with the tone of what you're saying, but I think there are some mitigating circumstances about it. I hope that answers the question.
Bruce, thank you very much for your time and sharing with our academic community and your many insights. And I'd just like to thank the East Georgia academic community for their participation in this event. And thank you all very much. We are at our time limit, and this will officially conclude Constitution Day for 2020. But may these constitutional ruminations and thoughts continue as throughout the year. And we've certainly got about 42 days, I think, of thinking about this. And Dr. Cazzo has promised to wear this hat to class for the rest of the semester, so we can look forward to that. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Dr. Frohnen. Thank you, School of Social Sciences, and thank you, Political Science faculty.